Thank you, Larissa. I just wanted to say you've put forward some really provocative ideas as well as a great overview of this area. And so I think it's a wonderful setup to our discussion. For that discussion, I invite all of you to turn your cameras back on. I expect that there will be many questions for Larissa, and so that we can dive deeper into this topic. Again, feel free to submit your question in the chat if you like. And I'd like to introduce Wyatt Archer, who will be moderating our Q&A. Wyatt?
Awesome. Thank you, Lisa, and thanks, Larissa. It's been really fun working with Larissa on this project because I'm so used to finding fire information like on the internet. And when we were out surveying that site near Bear Lake, I saw her working with her students and I was like, oh, information comes from people doing research and then it gets put on the internet. So it's nice to see where the information comes from. We know that we have many wildfire experts here in our audience today. We welcome your questions and perspectives. Please drop them in the chat to everyone. Please don't chat me personally. I can't keep track of that. I've got like 3 people helping me pull up good questions. So make sure to put them in the chat to everybody. But to get us started, Larissa, most of our RSVPs indicated that the negative effects of wildfire, they were most concerned about damage to watersheds and air quality. What are the core reasons for this?
So the question is, what are the core reasons that watersheds and air quality can be damaged by wildfire? Okay. Yeah, so I didn't really talk about this too much, although this is an ongoing area of research at Utah State, which is that in post-fire landscapes, whenever there is a severe fire that kills a lot of the vegetation, you have an increased risk of post-fire erosion. And so that can lead to debris flows where you have kind of a massive amount of material sliding down hills, or it can lead to overland erosion where you just have sedimentation in getting into the waterways. So that's a huge concern. And especially in Utah where we have, we depend on our reservoirs for most of our water. So yeah, I think that's a valid concern. And we've actually got a stakeholder group of people across Utah who are interested and worried about this, who are involved with our research group. We're working in 12 watersheds across Utah to try to model fuel treatments that would reduce the risk of that post-fire damage to reservoirs and reduce the capacity that our reservoirs can hold. So that I agree, it's a big issue. For Utah, it might be one of the biggest issues, maybe even more so than the wildland urban interface, I'm not sure. And in terms of air quality, I also see that perspective as well. I know that there are populations that are sensitive to smoke with underlying health conditions, for example. That's a valid and huge concern. I will say that there has been research on smoke from prescribed fires versus wildfires, and prescribed fire smoke tends to be, you don't get as much smoke, and it doesn't last as long as when you get a catastrophic major out of control wildfire. So I think that I know I have a point of view which is that wildfire doesn't have to be bad, but I think that that's a good example of how that's another side benefit of trying to burn in more mild conditions.
Yeah. Colby Walker from KSL wants to know, is Utah already performing controlled burns or other fire management plans? If so, what does that look like? If not, what would that look like, or how would it impact the average Utahns? So what's up with controlled burns in Utah?
Yes. Well, yes, there are actually a lot of private citizens who burn like agricultural fields in Utah. So that might be what you see the most, people burning their stubble off of their cropland. The Bureau of Land Management does they manage a lot of the low rangeland in Utah, and they have stopped burning as much, mostly because of that cheatgrass issue that I was talking about earlier. They have basically learned that that burning is not, basically increases the risk of more cheatgrass invasion. At higher elevations, yes, there are prescribed fires that happen in Utah. I will say that there is not as much as in other states surrounding us, partly because of the type of forest that we tend to have here. We don't have that, we don't have as much of the dry, open, ponderosa pine dominated forest. And so it's a lot harder to burn, do high severity prescribed fire. There is some of that. There have been a couple of examples up in outside of Logan, other parts of Utah as well. But they've, been fairly successful in burning some, doing some prescribed crown fire in Utah. So I would say in that way, maybe we're kind of at the forefront of prescribed fire, is doing these high severity burns.
How much are we doing? Are we doing enough? How much more would we have to do to be doing enough, do you think?
Well,
with prescribed burns.
Yeah, we are, it's a drop in the bucket what is happening now. For many good reasons. I guess I'll just say that as well. There's a lot of, again, there's smoke regulations, there's funding, there's the fact that whenever you have a good burn window, the firefighters might be off doing something else. There's a lot of reasons we don't do as much prescribed fire. And then back to the whole ecological reason is that, doing a low severity underburn is not really probably going to work in some of our forests. So you actually have to have a lot more preparation going into a prescribed crown fire. So yeah, we are not doing nearly enough to really make any kind of a difference, which is why I think wildfires are a quicker way to get to where we need to be.
Yeah. We have another question, which is lumber is kind of a precious resource right now. Why isn't there more logging happening? How could that help here in Utah?
Yeah, so there is still some logging in Utah. We don't have very, we think about where really productive forests are, where the forests are that make a lot of wood every year. The Southeast makes wood really fast. So they are the new kind of lumber basket of the country. The Pacific Northwest also produces a lot of lumber. They have just a lot more rain. The forests are a lot more productive. So Utah being pretty high and dry, we don't have really fast growth. And then the other thing that I think, one factor is that there was a lot of timber lumber industry about 100 years ago or 120 years ago, and we don't have a lot of the infrastructure for extensive kind of sustained logging across a lot of our land. And then and part of that is because, just back to what I was saying about productivity, it's kind of hard to make a profit off of logging some of the lands in Utah. The trees are just not that big. They don't grow back fast enough. It'd be hard. It's a little bit hard to sustain an industry. I think that's part of the reason.
David Wright wants to know, of all the recent fires, what are the USU studies telling us about future reforestation potential? In other words, what is the potential for ecosystem recovery?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And that is an area of active research in my lab. And so it's actually, I think one of our main sites has been down at the Bryan Head Fire in southern Utah. And there are areas within that fire where regeneration, especially of aspen, is looking really, really good. So that fire is probably going to switch from conifer dominated to aspen dominated for at least a few decades in some areas. The conifers, there's patches big enough that I haven't seen any conifer regeneration for large areas. But we have surveyed several other recent fires in Utah, and overall, I think we are not seeing the type of ecologically devastating fire that has been seen more often in the Southwest, for example, Arizona and New Mexico. Whether that's because the high severity patch sizes are smaller, or that would probably be a main reason, because that means you can still have seeds coming into an area. But overall, I think that the outlook for many of the forest fires that I've seen is that we do have forests that are regenerating. And some of them look fantastic.
Yeah, What does a fantastic regenerating forest look like?
Just crowded with baby trees. So just, you know, they can't even all survive. There are so many of them.
So Lynn Burney from Salt Lake County Watershed wants to know, are there any successful strategies for managing or reducing the cheatgrass invasion?
That is a good question for a lot of people at Utah State that probably that list does not include me. I know that a lot of people are working on that, how to restore sagebrush, how to get rid of cheatgrass. And I would say there should be another research landscapes event on that. So I don't have to answer that question, but yeah, I know that there's a lot of research going into it. And I think we'll skip that one for now. That's all right.
Okay. Rob wanted to know if goats could be used to reduce cheatgrass, but I guess if you can't answer that, what can like goats and grazing do for managing fire risk?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. And there are actually goats for hire in California now in some areas that goats are being put out, they'll eat anything. And so they're being used even in chaparral areas to try to reduce the fuel around the wildland urban interface in some towns in California. I think that would be a good use for goats, you know, right around a wildland urban interface where you really just don't want fire to be able to spread in. I don't think that they're a good idea across vast landscapes because I don't think we want to return to the 20th century where we tried to eliminate fire. So specific localized areas, goats, I think, are a great idea.
Yeah, so goats can help a little. We got a little bit of, tiny bit of timber industry happening in Utah. Deborah Sigmund wants to know, are there any other innovative management concepts that we could look to, especially ones that have like an economically advantageous method where somebody could turn a profit from it and like support jobs and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, and I think, you know, I don't want to make the timber or lumber industry sound completely dead in Utah. There is still some going on, but I think, you know, I think using the wood for products other than lumber, so pellets or pallets, things that you need small diameter trees for, would be that there are efforts to try to increase the amount of industry we have that can utilize that small diameter wood. One of my colleagues, Darren McAvoy, also is really interested in biochar. So he's interested in how we can use wood, whether we can turn wood into a product that can be sold in a form that's not wood anymore. It's biochar, and that's formed by burning wood at low oxygen. So it's basically kind of like charcoal, and it can be added to agricultural fields, for example, to like increase water storage and nutrients. And so I think that's probably not very close to being an operational way to make money yet, but I think that's a really interesting area for research.
P. Trader wants to know, what are the parallels and or differences between the fire exclusion phase that started in 1911 and our country's dam building phase used to control and suppress floods?
Oh, yes. Well, that's interesting.
Good, I'm happy you understand that question because it went over my head.
Actually, I love that question because working with my same colleagues in the Watershed Sciences program, we actually wrote a paper a couple of years ago on that, about that, basically tailored to that question. It was an interesting kind of interdisciplinary paper that we wrote about exactly that. So those two phases overlap perfectly, where we nearly eliminated fire from our landscapes, and that is almost the exact same time where all of our big dams were built. And so I think I mean, we just were realizing that I think a lot of the predictions for how much water, or estimates of how much water we had on our landscapes, and how quickly, you know, what kind of sediment were coming down the rivers were based on this fire-free period. And so, you know, it's interesting to think now what a lifespan of a dam is under normal sedimentation or quote unquote normal sedimentation loads versus what they would be like with a kind of historical amount of fire putting sediment into those waterways. I think, yeah, it's a little bit nerve-wracking to think about how much more sediment could come into our waterways than we realized at the time we were building all of those dams. Sorry, that was kind of meandering, but hopefully I answered that question. They overlap very well.
When you're working with the Forest Service personnel, what are their frustrations?
I think one frustration is well, I don't know if I should speak for them, but I guess I'm not speaking for anybody in particular, but I think that one frustration is public support, you know, so I think that they, in many situations, it would be nice to have a public that that was on board with trying to get more fire into our landscapes. You know, I think that it would be helpful if there was public support. In some communities around the West, there is full public support for prescribed fire, and even an understanding of the fact that fire can play a beneficial role. I mentioned, I think already, that I lived in Flagstaff before this, and there's an example of a community that actually voted yes on a $10 million bond to do prescribed fire and other fuel treatments in the watersheds above that town. And so there's a lot of public support in places where there has been kind of a long history of cooperation between the federal, you know, Forest Service managers, community leaders. And so I think it's definitely possible. And there's a push towards collaboration involving stakeholders early on. But I think that is something that, you know, everyone wishes there were more of, is there was more, you know, public support for what's trying to happen. I think also any individual manager of a federal agency is likely frustrated by the bureaucracy and the red tape that they have to go through on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That kind of leads into a question from Alexis Sand. What can and should local planning commissions be doing to limit or manage the risk of fire to residences and businesses? She wants to know if there's kind of anything happening in Cache Valley or down in Salt Lake. And then are there any political risks that they're having to deal with are they sticking their neck out too much if they're asking for more burns?
I don't think so. In fact, I think the state of Utah is doing a pretty neat job trying to encourage communities to do fire reduction, fire preparation around communities. And I should have looked up the details of this before this talk, but one of the things that's happening, someone on the call I'm sure knows more than I do, but one of the things that's happening is that communities are being required to do some work if they want to be kind of covered by the state fire suppression units that are available, and not have to pay for any kind of suppression that's needed on in their communities. And so there are, I think that, you know, I feel I should do more research and get back to you on this question, but I think that there are some kind of neat things happening. I don't think it's sticking anybody's neck out to do fire preparation. And in fact, there's funding at the state level for communities who want to do, and not even whole towns, it can be neighborhoods who want to do some fire preparation work. So in terms of planning commissions, I don't know. I don't know enough about that. But at the local level, there are both resources, there's support, there's money, and there's encouragement to do fire preparation.
Thank you. Okay. Scott Evans wants to know, are controlled burns used much in P/J communities? Changing is a practice that is difficult to get agency approval. Some mastication efforts are being used. What can be done in these areas of encroachment?
Yeah, so PJ is pinyon juniper.
What's P/J? Because
it's a pinyon juniper.
Okay.
So that's in northern Utah, we mostly have juniper, but it's a big vegetation. Pinyon and juniper tend to grow together. So if you've ever seen kind of short-ish trees when you're driving south of Salt Lake City, that's what that PJ community looks like. It's a woodland more than what you think of as a tall aspen and, you know, spruce and fir and pine forest. So yeah, I think that similarly to, you know, the sagebrush community, there is still risk of cheatgrass in a lot of that PJ environment. And so PJ is also tricky because there, you know, it's been shown that some pinyon juniper communities used to burn historically frequently at low severity. And those tend to be the ones that are kind of spaced out, open, just like the ponderosa structure. And then others, more dense, more kind of bunched up canopies used to burn every few hundred years in high severity crown fires. And so even just within the pinyon juniper community, the historical fire regimes really varied depending on where you were talking about and how exactly those plants grew. So I think that it's, you know, depending on the objectives of a manager, yes, prescribed burns can be used, but I think that cheatgrass is a concern. In terms of chaining, yeah, I think that is being used less probably than it used to be, although I'm not actually sure about that. Yeah, I think that those mechanical treatments are more often used than the prescribed fire in a lot of cases, mostly for the invasion risk.
Yeah, we only have a couple minutes left,
Okay.
so we're going to try and do these quick fire.
Okay.
What are the biggest messaging challenges surrounding wildfire perceptions in Utah?
Okay, well, I think that my talk was fairly, I tried to simplify, but I think that everyone can see it's somewhat complicated. There are different fire types and forest types, and not even all high severity fire is bad. And so I think it's trying to convey the complexity of fire in a simple way. I think that's really is a big challenge.
Yeah,
Smokey the Bear Smokey the Bear was great, but too simplistic. So how do we move on from Smokey? I think is people are trying to think about that.
Mm-hmm. What are the biggest one or two things you'd like the public to know?
I think it goes back to my main takeaways, which is that, you know, we can't live in a world without fire. I think it's unrealistic to expect that managers can suppress all fires, and we shouldn't want to. And so I think that, you know, those are the biggest, we need some fire on our landscape in order to prevent the catastrophic type of fire. So I think that I would just go back to my takeaways for the big messages.
Yeah. So every forest is different, every fire is different. So things are complicated. Do you think our wildfire challenges are too big to solve? Can changes in management really make a difference?
That's a great question. I have seen examples of places where real progress is being made. So I think that it is solvable. It is mostly happening at a pretty local level. And so, you know, nationwide, I'm not sure, you know, I think some pretty major changes need to happen, but there have been successes locally. And so I feel optimistic.
Can you give an example of some of those local successes?
Yeah, I think that, you know, my best examples are back from the Southwest. That's where I'm really familiar with. But there are, you know, places where, so not just near communities, but also in wilderness areas, for example, where fire has pretty much been restored to, or nearly restored to its natural state. So those are, you know, in the absence of people, it's pretty easy. Even around communities though, I mean, just back to Flagstaff, but also Boulder, Colorado has done a good job, Santa Fe, New Mexico, there are examples of communities where there's, you know, collaboration among multiple stakeholders, everyone's on board with trying to prepare landscapes and communities for the inevitable coming of fire, and the risk has been lowered, the risk has been reduced.
Okay, awesome, good to hear that there is hope. So thanks, Larissa. Before we end, we wanted to recognize those who scored highest on our wildfire quiz. David Tellian and Colleen Nordberg, they both got perfect scores and they've just won themselves some USU swag, which we'll send to them soon. Thank you so much, Larissa, and I'm going to turn it back to Lisa to finish out this event.
And I'd like to also say thank you to Larissa for a really thought-provoking presentation. And thank you to all of you for joining us today and for your great questions. Before you leave, we'd appreciate you sharing some feedback with us on the event. There's going to be a survey link appearing in the chat. We'd appreciate if you'd fill that out. We are thinking that we're going to be back in person come October of this year, and we're very much looking forward to it. That will occur at the O.C. Tanner building in Salt Lake City, and we'll send out more details as they become available. Many of you, however, are outside driving distance of Salt Lake City and have requested access to recordings of these events, and we'll work to make that content available. To hear more about Larissa's research, I encourage you to reach out to our research podcast called Instead, which will be linked in the chat. Again, thank you to all of you who joined us today, and have a good summer.